In 1938, in the whole of Britain, there were 8,500 prisoners. There are now more than 85,000. Violent attacks are much, much higher than they once were. It's obvious that the crime rate has increased enormously. Crime statistics in this country are deeply and deliberately misleading. The worldview of people being feathers on the wind of circumstance has spread right throughout the population. What I saw was really far worse than anything I described. I kept a diary, and it was so terrible that nobody could read it.
Hello and welcome to episode 64 of The Sceptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Anthony Daniels, who perhaps better known under his pen name Theodore Dalrymple, who is a former psychiatrist and prison doctor. He is the acclaimed author of Life at the Bottom, which is a collection of essays about those experiences, among many other books. And his writing on various subjects has featured in pretty much every publication going, as far as I can tell. Welcome to The Sceptic, Tony.
Well, thank you very much.
So it's a quarter of a century since your acclaimed essay collection, Life at the Bottom, came out, and there's going to be a 25th anniversary edition coming out later this year. And I think it really has had a lasting cultural impact on a lot of people. I mean, a lot of conservatives I know really point to that book as almost the basis of their worldview, or certainly an enormous change in. I mean, I count myself among them, actually. But I suppose, well, before we get into all of the issues you're exploring there, tell us a little bit about your career until writing those essays. Why did you feel the need to report on what you were seeing?
Well, I'd led a slightly, I wouldn't say rackety life, but slightly varied life until I settled down and became a consultant psychiatrist in a general hospital and in the prison next door, where I also did ordinary medical work. And the first of the essays in the book was about 4 years after I started doing that. And one of the reasons, I think, was that what I was seeing so appalled me that I felt it had to be brought before the public. Obviously, I had to use a pseudonym and had to disguise things. But and actually, what I saw was really far worse than anything I described. At one point, I kept a kind of straightforward diary of what I was seeing every day, day after day, and hearing hearing the stories and so on. And it was so terrible that nobody could read it. So I had to shape it into some kind of literary form. So that people could read it. But I felt it was necessary to say it because people, oddly enough, although what I'm describing is, in my view, visible everywhere in the country, people didn't see it or chose not to see it. This is not a new phenomenon. Thackeray once said to Mayhew, when Mayhew's book about the poor in London came out, it was there in front of us, but we did not see it until you pointed it out.
And can I ask, you say you had to choose a pen name. Why in particular was it Theodore Dalrymple, that somewhat pompous pen name there?
That's what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to sound slightly old-fashioned and bad-tempered and like a man drinking port and lamenting the state of the world. And in a way, I was lamenting the state of the world, although not with a glass of port in my hand. And also, of course, it had to be someone who didn't actually exist. I couldn't take a name, so we checked briefly that there was no such person, and I thought it was actually rather a good name. I think it wasn't my invention. It was the invention of Dominic Lawson of the Spectator, where I first started writing my articles about what I was seeing and hearing in the Spectator, which I did for about 14 years, actually. And what I saw and heard was both terrible and funny, so that one wasn't quite sure whether one was going to throw oneself off the roof or collapse with laughter, both at the same time.
And so you say that the name was designed to conjure up a posh gentleman drinking port, lamenting this decline, which of course it does. But one way in which you're not quite like that out-of-touch aristocrat is that actually you really are down with these people and you're observing this right close up. And I think that's a tension that you draw out throughout your work, actually, is that the types of liberal sociologists or social workers or intellectuals or whatever else who at times you rub shoulders with, they don't see the plight of the underclass in as direct a way as you were able to.
No, I was privileged in that way. And of course, what I was writing was not scientific in any way, in the sense that it wasn't a properly constructed sample, but nevertheless, it was a very large number of people I must have seen at least 10,000 people and heard about their lives, not only their lives, but the lives of people around them. And so, although it was, as I said, not a scientifically constructed sample, it was so large that you couldn't just say, well, it was anecdotal. And furthermore, when I talked about crime and so on, I think if you look at the statistics, what I said is borne out in the statistics as well.
Well, that's an interesting point because it's a debate that's raging today, of course. I dare say it was raging when you were writing these essays as well, because there are commentators who will, for instance, infer from the fact that the murder rate in London has been relatively low for a while, of around 100 a year or so, and say, well, actually, London has never been safer. I mean, of course, you were writing about Birmingham, but similar trends apply. And they'll suggest, therefore, that anyone who is complaining that London has gone to the dogs is not properly understanding the facts. But this is kind of a way of missing the point by focusing on some data points when actually clearly there's crime everywhere, isn't there?
Yes. I mean, I was for a literary project. I happened to be reading a book by a man called Sir Leo Page, who was very interested in crime. He was a magistrate and an academic, I think, as well. He said, apropos of what he was then writing about, which was juvenile delinquency, that in 1938, in the whole of Britain, there were 8,500 prisoners. There are now more than 85,000. In fact, 87,500 was the last time I looked. That's 10 times as much. Well, of course, the population has increased. So there are probably 6 times as many prisoners now as there were in 1938, proportionately with the population. But that is not all. There are now 6 times as many indictable crimes per prisoner as there were in 1938. And so, I mean, this is a very coarse way of looking at it, but it's obvious that the crime rate has increased enormously since 1938. And when I read Sir Leo Page's book, which was published, I think, in 1951, it was called The Young Lag. It was about young delinquents, really. And it's astonishing to realize that in 1951, people who stole a bicycle could be sent to prison. Well, I think you'd probably have to steal 10,000 bicycles now to be sent to prison. And I think, again, it's part of everyday experience of people who have lived through this period that one is afraid of crime now in a way that one wasn't when one was growing up. And so this is these are perfectly ordinary reflections. But in any case, the murder rate, of course, I'm pleased if the murder rate has stayed constant, hasn't gone up. But what you have to remember is that murder is a slightly unusual crime. But even so, it's not quite as reassuring as it was, as most people think, because there was a paper I think it was in a Journal of the American Medical Association, who said that if we used the same surgical and resuscitation techniques now as we used in 1960, the murder rate would be 5 times what it is. Because people survive attacks, which they wouldn't have survived many years ago. So in other words, violent attacks are much, much higher than they once were. And if you say, well, crime is more or less constant, of course, that's preferable to the crime rate going up. Nevertheless, it's so high that it's nothing to be proud of, and it's not grounds for complacency. And furthermore, I should say this, I haven't done this for a certain number of years, but the crime statistics in this country are often deeply and deliberately misleading. The Home Office misleads the public. So, for example, it changed terminology not that long ago. I can't give you the exact times because I'm not obsessed by this. I'm not a scholar of it. But they changed the terminology so that now they talk about repeat offenders. Yes, they talk about reconviction rate as if the reconviction rate were a guide to the offending rate, which of course it isn't. It would be if every time someone committed a crime, he was convicted. But in fact, we know that the rate of conviction by comparison with the number of crimes is extremely low. And we also know that the police manipulate the figures. Sometimes, for example, they refuse to in fact, quite often, refuse even to record a crime as having taken place. So, of course, that's one very good way of reducing the crime rate. Is simply not to acknowledge that there is a crime, that a crime has been committed. And this is standard practice.
And so in the first essay of the book, you set out one of the reasons that crime has been going up. And, well, that's 32 years ago, so I'll just remind you of it. But it's titled, "The Knife Went In." And that's this very jarring phrase used by a lot of the criminals that you would speak to about their crimes, or obviously knife crime in particular in this case, but which sort of disassociates them from the actual physical responsibility of taking the act and instead implies it's a kind of sociological event that happened to happen at that moment. And as you draw out, this illustrates a much wider worldview that people aren't necessarily really responsible for their actions.
Yes, on the other hand, of course, they know it's not true. I mean, the human mind is it's a complex instrument, so that they can know something is not true and claim it to be true at the same time. So it's not straightforward. But where someone says the knife went in, what he's implying is that the knife guided the hand rather than the hand guided the knife. And this was a very, very, well, I won't say it was a very common expression, because, of course, murder, thank goodness, is not a very common crime. I mean, it's still not a very common crime. But it is true that many criminals reflected back to me the kind of theories of why they committed crime that they had heard through the cultural grapevine, as it were. So that a burglar would say something like, well, he once said to me, once a burglar said to me, "Do you think I commit burglary because of my childhood?" And I said, no, absolutely nothing whatever to do with it. And I won't go on because I've told this story before. But what he's doing is actually reflecting the kind of language that he has heard, has either read or heard indirectly, in which crime is explained by social forces rather than anybody's decision to commit it.
And it's striking, isn't it, in terms of those social forces? Because, of course, the liberal hypothesis is that as poverty decreases, so crime should decrease as well. And certainly it's true that absolute poverty has plummeted over the past century or so, and yet the rate of crime has only gone up. So what's wrong with that worldview? Why is it not the case that poverty causes crime?
Well, first of all, even the poorest people have still to decide to act. They're not automata. Now, it's quite clear that if people are actually starving and so on, it's still a decision on their part to steal food, but it's one which we could understand. If you were extremely hungry and had no means of obtaining food, and you were an 8-year-old orphan or something like that, and you took some food, well, I think it would be exceptionally a hard-hearted person who said that that the child was an extremely wicked child. But that's not the situation that we're in today. It's people committing acquisitive crimes for, simply to acquire things, actually. And the crime rate has not declined with increased wealth, nor has it anything to do with equality, because equality now is not less than it was in 1938. I mean, it would be ridiculous to say that we live in a more unequal society than we lived in 1938. So something else must explain it. And one can argue about what it is. But if you say it is outside forces, you're already giving people a ready-made excuse in advance for their own behavior, which they, of course, don't really believe at some level of their minds. And it's the same with addicts. Addicts don't believe that they're suffering from illnesses, although they'll claim to be suffering from illnesses. The illness being addiction. I don't mean all the things that addiction brings with it. But they know that addiction is not just a straightforwardly an illness that just strikes people more or less at random. They know perfectly well that they've contributed to it.
So the subtitle of the book is interesting because there's a double meaning. So it's the worldview that makes the underclass. So in terms of it's the underclass's worldview, but also it's the worldview of the liberal elites which created the underclass in some way. And well, you've sketched some of that there. But what are the key elements of this, roughly, this liberal mindset that has allowed this to come about?
Well, before we go any further, I don't really like the concept of the underclass, because that implies that it's kind of the lumpen proletariat of Marx or something, a very small proportion of the population, which has always existed and is pretty well hopeless and so on, and it's hard luck for it, but it doesn't really affect the rest of society. I think that the attitudes that I'm talking about have actually affected a much larger proportion of the population than that. And in fact, the worldview of people being feathers on the wind of circumstance has spread right throughout the population, or a large part of the population. But it is rather a condescending view. It's suggesting that people can't do otherwise than they do, and it's unreasonable, unfair, unkind, unsympathetic, unempathetic to say to them that you can actually do something differently and better.
Indeed, it's almost a relativism in a way. And so, well, we've spoken about the worldview in the sense of it's not your responsibility in the approach to crime, but you also describe the more general problem of the underclass, or whatever you want to call it, not knowing how to live. And that reaches into many other domains of life.
Yes, yeah. And for example, quite a lot of girls who had become pregnant at an early age, and without any father other than a biological father, of course, in view, no connection with the father of the child. If you ask them what they actually want for their own child, what they want for their own child is a pretty conventional kind of life, where people have jobs, where they have stable relationships, have proper housing, of course. I mean, they want to be better off. But they have absolutely no idea about how to go around about achieving these things. And unfortunately, they are not going to be helped by any of the so-called helping professions. including the educational system.
And why do you think that is? I mean, it's a striking fact that in the same way that absolute poverty, certainly, and possibly relative inequality as well, has gone down over the past 80 or so years. And yet at the same time, as you mentioned in that essay, The Knife Went In, the ranks of the sociologists and the helping classes have ballooned. And yet there's only been an increase, it seems, in social degradation. So why is that?
Well, if I were a cynic or perhaps a Marxist, I would say that the helping professions need this kind of incompetence in living more than the people who suffer from it need the helping hand. Because the helping hand, the so-called helping hand, actually, in my view, often maintains the very kind of pathology which it's supposed to counteract. So a very large material interest has been created in keeping the whole situation going. Let me, with regard, take the question of illegitimacy. There's no question that in the past, illegitimate children were blamed for their own illegitimacy, which is cruel and stupid. And because of that, we have we have become, officially speaking, completely agnostic as to whether illegitimacy, that is to say, being brought up in single parent homes or traditionally normal homes, is better. We're completely agnostic about that. And that, I think, probably derives from a genuine and justified repulsion at the idea of blaming illegitimate children for their own illegitimacy, which undoubtedly existed. And I mean, in the old mental hospitals, you could find women who had been in mental hospitals in the back wards who had been there actually because they had given birth to an illegitimate child. So I'm sufficiently liberal to think that's terrible. But if this isn't an unfortunate expression, I think we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. And so we now think that it doesn't matter what kind of household children are brought up in, when clearly it does matter. I mean, it's obvious, actually. One of the things you can ask why Sikhs and the Jews have done so well when there was prejudice against them. I mean, there was no legal prejudice against them, but there was prejudice against them. And one of the obvious explanations is that they maintained their family lives. And again, this is talking in statistical terms because, of course, with all human phenomena on any large scale, you can always find exceptions.
And it does seem to speak to, as you mentioned, a certain relativism, basically, as to what is the best, or at least the normal family that people should be aiming for. And yes, it's true that you shouldn't be deliberately cruel to illegitimate children and single mothers and so on. But nevertheless, it would be helpful for people to have the guardrails and the standard to be pointed towards.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people are very afraid of, possibly they are most afraid of, is to be thought of as censorious. And so they say, I am non-judgmental, when what they really ought to be saying is, I don't want to be censorious, because censoriousness is a very unpleasant characteristic, and it's very easy to fall into censoriousness. But that's not the same as saying, I'm not going to make any judgment at all. And in fact, you can't not make a judgment, in fact. The very idea of being non-judgmental is absurd, and actually most people who say it preen themselves while they're actually saying it. So they are making a judgment. It's just a different kind of a judgment.
A sort of carefully cultivated aloofness.
Indifference, actually. Indifference. indifference to the outcome.
Yes, which is not the same as real compassion or really trying to take the part of the lower classes.
Not in my view, but I think I'm in a minority.
Well, it puts me in mind of someone who I was actually reading alongside a lot of these essays a few years ago, which is Christopher Lasch, the American historian, who famously talked about the revolt of the elites. And of course, there was the claim that the modern world was going to see the revolt of the masses, who were going to disrupt high culture and so on. But actually, what he argues is that you have the people at the top of the social hierarchy who, instead of guaranteeing these standards and transmitting them in the way that they should, well, they've actually completely forgone their role and are now saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter at all, which is an extraordinary way for those in power to behave.
Yes, yeah. Well, as the Russians say, I believe, a fish rots from the head down. I don't know whether that's true of fish, but it's probably true of societies.
And to turn to one of your other essays that's really nail on the head in terms of the liberal worldview here, well, because of course most of the book is your experience as a psychiatrist with these patients, but towards the end it's more diagnosing the liberal elites' worldview themselves, as it were. And so you're invited to what I believe you describe as a venerable liberal publication. I think that's probably the New Statesman, correct me if I'm wrong, to a dinner. And well, you're posed this extraordinary question after your dissident dispatches to their magazine, which, well, at least they are publishing, so that's good of them. But you're asked simply, did you make it all up? And, well, what did you make of that? Because it's an extraordinary question to ask. I mean, that anyone would think that.
Well, yes. I was a bit surprised. I didn't write my dispatches in the New Statesman. I sent them a few observations, but anyway, the chap obviously read the Spectator. I won't say who it is, but he was a very nice gentleman, actually, and intelligent. And I said to him, well, I'm very flattered that you think that I could make it all up, but actually, I don't make it all up, and if you care to come with me, I will show it outside your door. I will point to where what is going on, which is similar to the kind of things that I describe. So it seemed to me that this was a kind of a willful blindness, partly caused by an awareness that it's extremely difficult to think of how to correct it, actually. I'm sometimes criticized for not providing any solution to the problem, and it's certainly true that I haven't provided any solution to the problem. And one of the reasons that I haven't supplied one is that I can't think of very easy solutions to the whole problem. But the first thing to do is to admit the phenomena, and we're still at the phase of not admitting the phenomena.
So the 25th anniversary edition of the book is coming out this year. Were you surprised, or have you been surprised over the course of its publication at its reception? Because it really has become quite a totemic set of essays. And did you expect this to be the result?
No, I didn't even expect it to be published in the first place, actually. It was the editor of the magazine, for the City Journal in America, for which I wrote the essays, who suggested that it should be put in a book, and I thought that it wouldn't interest anyone. And so it surprised, and it never occurred to me that they would go into a book, let alone that the book would... I mean, I can't say it's a bestseller in the sense that... it flew off the shelves. Apart from anything else, it was never put on the shelves. I don't think I've ever seen it in a bookshop, for example, and yet it has sold quite a large number of copies. What surprised me was that it was a great success. When I say a great success, I mean for this kind of thing in the Netherlands, where you would least expect it to be. I mean, it was translated into Dutch, and it went through many printings. And even more pleasing to me was that it had a reasonable sale in Brazil. And perhaps the most The most gratifying thing in the response to it that I ever had was when I gave a talk in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And I had a signing afterwards, and a young man and a woman came up to me and said that they issued from the favelas. They had climbed out of the favelas, the very poor, the slums, really, of Sao Paulo. And they said that they recognized everything that I'd said in everything about them in Brazil, which to me was, it's gratifying to me as a diagnostician or an observer rather than a diagnostician, an observer. But I found it surprising. And so I've been rather surprised by it. I mean, it has continued to sell for 25 years, but more as a kind of trickle or stream rather than as a torrent or a huge river.
Well, fair enough, and it's still in print and coming back round again. But have there been any developments since? Is any part of it out of date, would you say, or indeed perhaps have these problems only got worse?
Well, I'm not able to say whether it's got worse from the phenomenological point of view because I've been out of that world for quite a long time. I mean, obviously there are some developments since I wrote the book, which I didn't foresee. I don't think anybody did. That's to say the social media. And I don't know, I've not really had any experience of what effect that actually has, either for the better or the worse. I suspect probably for the worse in some sectors of society. I rather doubt that anything much has changed fundamentally. Certainly not in this country. Not for the better, possibly not for the worse. I don't know. You would probably be in a better position. I'd be interested to know whether you thought that it had got better or worse.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it does seem that to an extent, family policy and things like this are a little bit more acceptable to talk about politically nowadays. Whether that actually trickles down into much of an effect on the wider country is less obvious. But certainly, maybe 10 years ago or so, I think it would have been quite difficult for anyone to say, well, how about the two-parent family? Let's think about that, shall we? Whereas now there is a bit more space for that. I think there's various reasons for that. But, in terms of the total level of social degradation, I don't know. But
all one can say is that it's bad enough to be alarming, irrespective of whether it's a little better or a little worse. I mean, so for example, if the crime rate in this country went down by 20%, of course, that would be welcome because that would mean that there were 20% fewer victims of crime and so on and so forth. But it still wouldn't mean that we were a crime-free, there's no crime-free society, but we have a level of crime which, in a sense, is acceptable to most people. I mean, we're well beyond that. So minor improvements or minor deteriorations are not really the question here.
What I would say, though, is that the phenomenon that has become quite noticeable, that you may have heard of, is anarcho-tyranny. And this captures various things, but roughly it begins in a mindset that is very much like the one you describe, which is to say that, really to put any boundaries on, let's say, the criminal classes is in some way sort of oppressive and restrictive of their liberty, and that you need to approach them, as a sociologist as opposed to a policeman. I mean, there are adverts for the Met, I think now, which start something like, you've got a criminal in the back of your car, he's committed a crime, but he's vulnerable, and he might need your help. and this could be your job. And it's sort of like, hold on, are you signing up to the Met to catch criminals, or are you a social worker? And that mindset is very deeply baked in, I think. But so there's that on the one hand in terms of the treatment of the criminal classes, but then on the other hand, what the government does find it very easy to deal with and exert its power over are the productive classes, who are ever more taxed and policed in all kinds of minor ways. And I think the best example I've seen of this is actually in response to a spate of knife crimes in central London. The Met decided to set up a knife metal detector at a station, and it was Clapham Junction. And so, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, and you had these commuters from the commuter belt, clearly in professional clothes, coming to work hard in the capital at their professional jobs where they're probably paying very, very high taxes, being forced to go through a knife metal detector. And clearly these were not the types of inner city youths who were going to be committing these types of crimes, but nevertheless they were the ones experiencing this tyranny. And so while that would be one way that I think this situation has changed and become, well, the two-tier element has actually become much more obvious, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think the therapeutic ideal has been thoroughly absorbed and used to its advantage by certain people. I'll give you a little example that happened on a train recently when I was on a train, a journey of about nearly 2 hours. And I was in the quiet carriage. And there was a young man with his purveyor of music on a table, playing rap music very loudly, and he didn't look a very nice chap, actually, insofar as you could see him at all, the hoodie and all that kind of thing. And eventually, I got up and I went to him to ask him to turn it off.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.